Hello, my name is Walid Saqqaf. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Rebalance Earth, and I'm absolutely delighted today to be joined by Ben Knight, head of environment sustainability at GoCardless. Ben, thank you for joining us today. Could you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, no worries, and thank you for inviting me today, Walid. It's great to be here. So I'm Ben. I'm head of environmental sustainability here at GoCardless. I joined the business back in the summer, so nearly I think 5-6 months in now. But GoCardless is a global fintech platform. So we've got around 65,000 customers globally, and we've got bases in the UK, in the US, Australia, France, and Germany. And we're probably our headcount's around 800, so we're above an SME, but we're not quite a big corporate yet. But certainly a lot of plans to scale up. And essentially, without going into the details, we move money for our customers from one account to the other account. So the idea is to help the customers take the pain out of being paid. So really helping with the economic sustainability for our customers. But the reason why I joined back in the summer was I think there's a real potential impact that the fintech sector can have in both climate action, but then wider sustainability. So, something I know we're going to talk about, but biodiversity and communities and things,
Mm.
which I think is really important. And then for me personally, the reason why I do sustainability, I've got two young kids, and I think it's from a personal level, I try to do everything I can to try and ensure we leave a more sustainable future for those generations that are around now, but those to come as well.
That's brilliant, and yeah, I couldn't agree more about how having young children is definitely a factor in in fighting for a more sustainable environment. But I'm curious to know, I mean, is this something you had mainly because you have kids, or were you always slightly more naturally intended to have this kind of view regarding sustainability? I mean, what is your background regarding sustainability as an individual?
Yeah, it's a good question actually. So I didn't actually. I've always had I guess, an interest in nature and the environment. When I was growing up, so I grew up you know, in the outskirts of London, but my family and my brothers would always take me out and actively involved in nature, getting up into the hills and the mountains and things like that. But professionally, I actually started out. So I trained in acoustics and audio engineering. So hence why you can probably see a few bits of
Yes,
musical
in the background.
um, so yeah, and I still do music stuff and things like that. But my path into it was I went initially into construction and the real estate sector. I spent quite a few years doing that. As part of that, I was always quite involved in environmental management.
Hmm.
So yeah, yeah, I guess where it's looking at materials or the impacts of those projects. But then also, I guess on the social side of things, trying to really engage people on well-being and things like that of those teams working on those projects. I then ended up going into real estate, but also in the space sector, which is quite
Hmm.
interesting. So for a company called OneWeb, which is where I really then got into sustainability in a much bigger sense. So looking at the carbon measurements for the embedded carbon in satellites, for example, or the emissions from rocket launches and things like that, which was super exciting. And that was, I was there for close to 4 years, I think now, and then I moved across into GoCardless, where I'm now doing sustainability for the majority of digital things. So it's been a really interesting going from physical satellites and rockets to fintech, which is mostly digital. But yeah, and then outside of I guess my professional work, I volunteer for my local council and some environmental groups as well. So really trying to make an impact at a local level. So looking globally as what we do with GoCardless, and then trying to do as much as I can for the local communities as well.
Brilliant. So let's focus a little bit about Go Cardless. I mean, so obviously you were brought in on this summer, to head environmental sustainability. Is this a role that existed prior to you joining? I mean, how important is sustainability to Go Cardless as a business, and why?
Yeah, I mean, and that's a great question. So it was a newly created role. So earlier in the year, so very much led by our CEO Hiroki and our CFO Catherine. We joined the Tech Zero Coalition, which was a group of it was a now group of around 200 plus businesses, all different shapes, sizes, from startups up to big corporates, all committed to taking climate action. And so we were one of the co-founders of that. And so I guess that was the starting point for us to really start on the climate action journey. But outside of that, there's already some really fantastic work that happens at GoCardless on diversity and inclusion and well-being, and that was something that I guess really drew me to the business, knowing that there was that commitment and engagement as well, really really key. So there's the commitment from the executive team, but also there's really great engagement across the employee base. So I think for me, embedding sustainability across the whole business is really important. Obviously, there's only me that's doing sustainability as a role, so I can't be everywhere doing everything. So it's trying to really empower every GC, GCs being my employees, and not my employees, so my colleagues, and really helping them to take the action in their roles and their daily lives as well. So um, I think the why is always a great question for businesses because, and again, when I was going through the interview stage, it was important for me to find out why the role was created and really what the drivers behind it. And I think certainly the customer focus was really important. So a lot of our customers are certainly looking to embed climate action and wider diversity and inclusion and well-being into their supply chains, and us as part of the supply chain have to start looking towards that. But then I think also the employee side is really big as well. So there was certainly a lot of um, calls from the employee base that we should be doing this, and so even before I joined, there was a Slack channel with already close to 200 people all talking about sustainability, which makes my life a lot easier because there's already that engagement. But I think that the wider context of the why, and there's certainly something that our CFO Kathleen talks about a lot, is that as a business, if you don't become a sustainable business, so I guess the true definition of sustainability is to continue to exist.
Yeah.
So you have to look at that as a business to be existing in 10, 20, 30 years time. And it's not just looking at what you're doing internally, it's how do you then engage with your customers and your employees and your suppliers? Because if you don't have customers in 10 years time, you're not a business. If you don't have employees in 10 years time, I mean, you can see where that goes.
Yeah.
um, so I think the why is generally quite an easy thing to look at eventually. Yes, and obviously it's the right thing to do, and ethically it's the right thing to do. But then the business case is becoming more and more clear for most businesses, I think. So, but I think the important thing is making sure that that action is honest and credible, because there's certainly some businesses out there who say we're going to do X, Y, and Z, um, and then don't. Yeah, and I think that's the really key thing. That's going to.
Exactly. There's quite a lot of things you just said I'd like to unpack a little bit, which is, i- in our experience, corporations who engage in the sustainability space usually do it for one or two reasons. Either it's a top-down approach, it's the management, the execs, the board who recognize this need to be more sustainable, or it's a bottom up approach, which is the employees who believe, that the business needs to be more responsible in its role regarding sustainability. But here in your case, you've got this both top down and bottom up approach, which is wonderful. But the other critical part, is how do you interact within your value chain, with your customers, with your partners. So the Tech Zero initiative, is one that demonstrates leadership. But I think there is this point you were saying about authenticity, right? Who would you say holds you accountable, to being authentic? Is it your employees? Is it management? Is it your customers, or is it everyone? What would you say to that?
I'd say it's everyone. I think certainly straight away our employees will be the first to challenge and call out anything that wasn't authentic. And I think that's why communicating internally probably is that slight step ahead, especially in what we've been doing recently in terms of our strategy. We've been communicating a lot internally first while we're developing what we're doing before we shout about it externally, because I think that's really important. But then you're absolutely right. Then customers will absolutely be going, well, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? And and how are you doing this? But I think the wider scope of it as well is probably our if we're looking to bring on investors, they're going to be asking us the same questions. What are you doing on? I guess they'll be looking from an ESG type criteria, but they'll be holding us to account, and then probably wider society as well. If we're making claims that aren't true or honest, then I think it's becoming such a you know, a mega trend across the whole of society that everyone's going to be starting to be engaged in it, and then they'll be holding companies to account, even if they're not necessarily a customer per se. So, and I think for us as well, because our customers are generally other businesses, they're then going to have their customers who are consumers. So if they start then looking at, okay, who are if I'm using company X, if we're part of that supply chain, then we will use this, and if they're not you know, aligning with my my own views and values, then that wider value chain will be also be holding us to account. So it's a long answer of saying everyone there, Wally.
Yeah. No, 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 and that's good because I think there are a number of businesses, let's say, who are trying to decide whether they should go down that path. There is still this illusion that going down a sustainability route is one that is a cost center and not a potentially a profit center. And what you said in your early on, which is very important, is that there is a strong business case, for sustainability. But I'm curious to know from your perspective, what are some of the top three challenges a business like GoCardless faces when you wish to go down the sustainability route? And in addition to those three top challenges, what are some of the top opportunities that have come out of it?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think obviously we've gone past this challenge as go cardless, but I think for a lot of businesses, initially getting the buy-in is probably a big challenge, and I certainly see that when I speak to other businesses. Their conversations are, how do we get our executive team bought into this, or how do we get our employees bought into this? And that's always, that initial step is probably a challenge, because you can't do it without getting buy-in from, like you say, from the top and the top up and the bottom up approach. So but luckily we've gone past that, which is fantastic. So I think specifically where we're at the moment, one of the challenges I find is um, specifically on our net zero and our emissions. So when we're measuring and reporting on our emissions, at the moment there's such a disparity across what other businesses are measuring and reporting on. So I know, for example, within two suppliers of ours that I looked at specifically, they have roughly the same headcount, roughly the same turnover. So you can assume that they're very similar in their operations, yet their reported emissions are so different, because
Yeah,
one might be looking at their scope 1 and 2, which is their operational, whereas the other one might be looking at scope 1, 2, and 3, which includes their wider value chain. And although that probably just sounds like a bit of an accounting issue, the problem with that is that when people aren't reporting on the same thing, it's very difficult to then compare suppliers, and then also understand who's then setting the same target. So if we set um, a net zero target, we know that net zero to us is aligned with the science based target initiative net zero standard. Whereas there are other businesses at the moment saying, "Hey, we're net zero already," and it's like, wow, how did you do that? And I think sometimes there's that confusion with businesses with carbon neutrality and net
yeah.
zero, and so I think those that's one of the challenges, is getting that standardization. Then I think probably then the third challenge is action. I would say so. There's a lot of businesses who have set targets, but then that next step of creating those action plans, of actually knowing how to decarbonize, is probably a little bit of a void at the moment, and that's certainly something that we're looking at in a lot of detail at the moment. Is how do we actually reduce our emissions, especially as a company that's a growth company as well. But then also, how do we help other businesses do it? So the workshop that we had the other week, which you kindly joined in, one of the sessions was we brought other businesses together to sit down and actually map out an action plan for them, because I think collaboration is so key, because no one can do sustainability, or no one can get to net zero by themselves. You've got to sort of work together and collaborate. It's really important.
Absolutely, and I think collaboration, as you said, it is the key. And just to clarify, to get to this kind of net zero is we're not talking here about just offsetting everything, right, to get to net zero. It is actually doing the necessary process changes for you to be able as a business to get to net zero. Offsets is just an assisting tool. It is not the predominant tool, because then that will go into the realms of greenwashing. Is that something that within your whole value chain, that's something you had to look at in terms of the your partners, customers, or who go in one way or the other, let's say?
Yeah, so I guess one of the big challenging areas for us is our purchase goods and services, which is essentially our supply chain. So I guess for context, our emissions are currently about 99.8% within what's known as scope three. So that's um, basically everything that
Everybody
isn't.
else.
Yeah, essentially, and there are elements in there which is under our control. So things like, or under our influence, I should say. So things like home working and commuting and waste investments. But then the and corporate travel, which will be a big one post COVID. But then a big part of that is our value chain. So anyone that we buy goods from, so maybe the laptop that I'm using at the moment, but also anyone who provides us a service, which could be financial or insurance, through to marketing and advertising, learning and development. So any business that provides a service also then produces emissions at the moment, until they then reduce their emissions to net zero. So at the moment, we what we're looking at doing is how can we in the future choose companies who are aligned to what we're doing, but then also we're also not going to say to our current supply chain, we're not going to use you if you're not doing this because it's not very fair and it's not very good for economic sustainability either.
Yeah.
So we'll be setting out targets. So we'll say, yeah, we'd like you to measure your emissions in this year and then set a target and then do X, Y, Z. So it's not a hard cut off, and it's quite a gentle process. But the really important thing is, because a lot of those businesses will probably be SMEs, we're going to also then give them tools to do that. So we've just released a free to use greenhouse gas calculator, for example, which doesn't sound very exciting, but it's I think 90% of SMEs don't currently measure their emissions. So
Yeah.
if they can spend 30 minutes using our free to use calculator to give them a rough outline, then at least they can understand what that looks like, and then they can go and work with, a more bespoke approach with a consultancy or a digital company to improve on that. But I think that's really important that, yes, so with our value chains, that we're not going to be just dictating, we're going to really be trying to help them, because then they'll be helping us as well.
Exactly, exactly. So talking about, targets and, let's say, key milestones, what are your plans for 2022 looking like?
Um, that's a really good question. I guess we had our pre-chat about COVID and things, which has kind of put some slight, I guess, interesting spanners in the works. So what we're currently looking at the moment is, so 2021, we joined Tech Zero. We then measured our emissions, and then we actually committed to something called Business Ambition for 1.5 degrees, which is essentially aligning our net zero strategy with the science-based target net zero standard, which, sorry, I know is a lot of jargon, but so that's really important, because that means that we're going to be setting a short-term science-based target, which is for the next 5 to 10 years, and then a long-term science-based target, which is essentially that long-term net zero, which under the standard that means reaching net zero before 2050. Now, for us, what we have to consider, because we're scaling up, is how do we decouple our emissions from our growth, but also for us as a relatively, I guess, slightly bigger than medium-sized business, and one that's not producing steel or cement, or we're
Yes.
not doing agriculture. 2050 is probably not ambitious enough. So we're certainly looking at how we pull that forward and where we can pull that forward to. But also importantly, I guess going back to that, how would you do that? What we didn't want to do is just commit and go, okay, we're going to be net zero by X date, without really having any inclination of how we do that, because that
Yes.
would be slightly irresponsible. And also, the net zero standard is, with science-based targets, is a 90% reduction in your emissions on absolute, or 97% reduction in emissions when compared to something like headcount. So it's it's not a case of we're going to reduce our emissions a little bit and then offset. Like you're going back to your original point, really. It's a real in-depth look at how you change your business
Yes.
and how you do business. And then once we get to that point of net zero, that's when, so we got to get my hand right here. So we reduce as much as we can, and then that last bit is neutralized under which basically means removed from the atmosphere. But then also on the pathway to that, what we're looking at is using what is now termed as compensation measures or traditional offsets, because
Yeah.
there is certainly a part to play in that, because one with whether that's helping sustainable development or new technologies, or by helping other elements like biodiversity and communities and things, that's also really important. So, so I guess our priorities are reduce our emissions, but then how do we then go beyond that to create value for climate, biodiversity, and communities?
So this is perfect because it brings me on to my last point, which is, the news that we're here to announce. Do you want to do the honors?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So I think potentially over the last few hours, so we've been delighted to announce our partnership with Rebalance Earth. Um, so every year, our customer team will give a gift to our customers. Um, and this year, well, I was really happy. So I didn't instigate this at all. Our team came to me and said, "We really want to do something that aligns with what we're doing on sustainability. What can you recommend?" And obviously, we'd had conversations about what we're looking potentially do in the long term through our fintech platform and things. And we thought there's a fantastic synergy, especially sort of post COP26, but also post COP15 on biodiversity, to really do something that delivers value for our customers, but then also the planet and in terms of climate, biodiversity, and nature and community. So we have agreed to essentially pre-purchase elephant time that equates to, I think, for 1 minute of each of our customers, and then we're going to then match it ourselves as well. And I think it's, for me, it's really exciting because obviously it's the project that you're doing is Rebalance Earth. Really, I think it's so important because it's not just focused on carbon. And my something I've noticed, there's a lot of carbon tunnel vision at the moment, whereas I think things have to be looked at so holistically. Carbon and climate are on the flip side of biodiversity, but then also you need to then look at communities. And so that's why I'm so excited that we're, we- we're working with yourselves to support the project in its initial stage, and then obviously we'll see where it goes in the future.
Exactly, and we're absolutely delighted, to have you on guys on board, and I just want to focus a little bit on this point you were saying, that it's not just a focus on carbon, and that it is also this element about biodiversity and this part about local communities. Well, is that one of the main attractions that brought you to Rebalance, and how is it important for you that to have it all under one holistic solution instead of having to put budget into one kind of project and another one and then another one? How, or do you believe that things should be treated in silos in a way, or do you believe that we are living in this kind of network kind of world where everything is interdependent?
I think I would say that in an ideal scenario, it would be great, with projects such as yourselves, because we are so everything is interconnected. So when
Yes.
we're talking about climate and biodiversity, the reason why I was first, I guess I should give the context of how I first came about Rebalance Earth. So
Yes.
in my previous role, I wrote a white paper, and I actually came across the IMF study about whales and things like that, and their carbon value. And so I was actually looking back then of how whether you could develop a system using satellites, obviously when I was in the space sector, that can monitor and protect whale populations. It's
Yeah.
slightly theoretical, but then
Yeah.
looked at, if you could bring whale populations back to pre-whaling levels, what the carbon benefit would be, but then the benefit on biodiversity too. And so then that's when I first found out about yourselves. I was like, wow, this is amazing, because we are so interconnected. So I think I think I was speaking to someone the other day talking about bees, for example, and a lot of, I know people say, "Oh, bees are important," but I don't think they quite know why. Obviously, bees then pollinate plants that feed 90% of the earth, and whales. Going back to the whales, they produce the phytoplankton that
Yes.
absorbs 40% of our CO2 and produces 50% of our oxygen. So in that biodiversity element, you then still have that interconnected with climate. But then I think really importantly, if you go back to the original idea of sustainability, the pillars are planet, people, and I guess in a sense prosperity as well, and community. So you have to take action on the natural environment alongside communities,
Yes.
and also considering economic sustainability. Because if you take action on one without considering the others, it can be detrimental. And I think the coming out of the COP15 for biodiversity, one of the main points there is that you, any action on climate shouldn't have an impact, a detrimental impact on biodiversity and community. So, for example, with tree planting, which is often sometimes become a little bit cliched in things, so buy product X and then we'll plant a tree for you. But then, as as our discussions with Martin from Woodland Trust, he said, sometimes depending on what you're planting, it can actually have such a negative impact on
Yes.
that ecosystem that you cause harm rather than good. So that's a long way of me saying that's why I think everything is so interconnected, and considering something holistically is really important.
Absolutely. And my final question to you, Ben, is for listeners and viewers of this video, let's say they're in a similar shoe like yourself, they're head of sustainability at their firm, but they're not quite sure where to start. As you said, there's this plethora of standards, there's, quite a lot of challenges and choices. You know, what are some of the top tips you would give them?
Probably something that I heard a few years ago, which is don't let the perfect get in the way of the good. That's a really important one. So no one has the perfect strategy or action plans of how they're going to tackle climate or help biodiversity and things like that. But it's better to start and do something and start on that journey rather than worrying about it and not starting at all. I think that's probably really important. But then yeah, then I'd then say take that first step, just get started on the journey. But then also you're making sure that you're taking action that's credible but honest. So if you don't have the answers, just be honest about it and say, look, we're currently working on it. Ourselves with our net zero strategy, we haven't published our target date yet because we're still working on the data of how we actually get there. So, um, but that's honest. I'd rather that than us say, hey, we're going to be net zero by 2030 with no idea about what that means. But then I think also then really importantly is how do you not only reduce your impact as a business, but then go beyond to create good outside of that. So whether that's for climate or the natural world or communities, because I think every business, no matter what it does, has that opportunity to create wider value. And then so you're going beyond being, I guess, reducing impact to becoming regenerative. So you can create good for the planet and society.
Perfect, perfect. Well, listen, Ben, I'm gonna thank you, so much, for sharing your insights and for your leadership, within this space. We wish there was a lot more of people like yourselves. And is it okay if members of the viewers, if they want to reach out to you, perhaps on LinkedIn, to share so that you could share some of your top tips with them? Would that be all right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And next year we're running more climate action workshops, and so if anyone wants to come along and collaborate and share stories and share, you're more than welcome to. Obviously, depending on numbers and COVID, but yeah,
Of
so,
course.
yeah, absolutely. Please reach out and happy to collaborate.
Thank you, thank you. And for you, we're also going to be launching next year a series of what we call the nature boot camps. That is here to also provide you some really useful education modules, some ideation workshops, so we can replicate, some of the approaches that GoCardless has taken in terms of working with the value chain, and also, of course, giving you the opportunity to join, in GoCardless and investing in climate change, in protection of biodiversity, and raising local communities out of poverty. That will be happening. We'll be announcing it very shortly next year. Ben, I look forward to having you back in January to celebrate our 1 year anniversary. And for now, I'm going to thank you very much. Until next time, Ben.
Great stuff.
Cheers.
Thank you, Willie.